When approaching any discussion on the topic of genetic modification, one of the most fun sources to look towards is Hollywood. So I'm going to play you a clip from David Cronenberg's The Fly. Now, if you're squeamish, stop watching, and we'll get back in a second. When most people think of genetic modification and the ways that it could go wrong, most people think of David Cronenberg's The Fly, but that's not really the case in any respect. If we're going to go into this can of worms, though, it's best to understand what we're talking about. So, what is genetic modification? Well, the working definition for the phrase, pulled straight from the Cambridge Dictionary, is
The process of changing the structure of the genes of a living thing in order to make it healthier, stronger, or more useful to humans.
that is just the tip of the iceberg. If we start going more in depth, genetic engineering
is the direct manipulation of an organism's genome using certain biotechnology techniques that have only existed since the 1970s. Humans directed genetic manipulation was occurring much earlier.
Natural selection tends to favor plants that can compete for
GMOs are one of the most controversial areas of science.
defending themselves from
Genetic used in
Okay, genetic modification means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. So let's break this down into bite-sized pieces. But first, let's get ready. Just let me have this. Gene manipulation can be broken down into three identical groups. Commercial, which includes human-made insulin and bacterial agents, agriculture, which is mainly just GMOs, and humanitarian, which can span from different medicines to outright gene manipulation. While all these topics are relevant, the two most important groups we're going to worry about is the more widely known issue of agricultural modification and the lesser understood humanitarian manipulation. Now let's get one thing perfectly clear. Genetic modification isn't a new or even a difficult thing. Technically, cavemen were able to genetically modify wolves through selective breeding as they attempted to domesticate the animal. Scientifically speaking, the first case of genetic modification was documented in 1972. Two scientists, Herbert Bauer and Stanley Cohen, were first able to directly modify the genome. So what does this allow scientists to do? Well, it allows them to tamper with an organism's DNA to remove or introduce strands that create or destroy traits in the organism. This technique allows scientists, farmers, and manufacturers to create an organism that better suits their needs. For farmers, GMOs are their main source of income. GMOs, or genetically modified organisms, cover a wide variety of uses. However, the most widely accepted use is in agriculture. GMOs can have traits that their wild variety lacks. Farmers can make plants hardier, yield a better harvest, or survive during seasons it never could. In many ways, GMOs allow for the expansive and specialized world we know today. Without this technology, many of our crops could never reach the supermarket shelves, and many of us would need to move closer to farms or rural areas. However, GMOs are not perfect. As plants grow more resistant to elements such as weeds and bacteria, these parasites grow increasingly more resilient to any attempt to kill them, which creates superbugs or superweeds. These pests are much harder to kill and result in more toxic pesticides being used in order to kill these super beings. Those toxic chemicals are traveling straight from the farm into your stomach and begin to destroy your insides from inside out. While the full effect of the GMOs are unknown, scientists around the world are growing more suspicious of their widespread use. Now comes my favorite part, humanitarian application. Remember that horrifying image of David Cronenberg's Fly? Well, luckily, that's not at all what genetic modification amounts to. Instead, most of the studies being done using these practices are much more humane and much more beneficial to our society. One scientist in the field, Dr. Paula Cohen, the lead scientist in her lab at Cornell University, is using this technique of gene manipulation through CRISPR technology, which allows her to move around DNA strands in the hopes of solving infertility and miscarriage. We asked her a few questions regarding her opinion on genetic modification, the ethical and scientific applications of the practice.
What is your overall opinion in human genetic modifications?
Unfortunately, Dr. Cohen is up in New York, so I will be reading her responses. I think we have to be careful about what we mean when we talk about genetic modifications. Are you thinking disease-curing modifications? If so, where does one draw the line? Are we talking about cystic fibrosis? If that's okay, then what about allergies? From there, short-sightedness. What about lactose intolerance? We rapidly go from a disease that causes death and or acute loss of life quality to ones that bring to cross a line between disease prevention and trait enhancement. If I have a bad skin condition that prevents me from going out into the sun, that should be fixable. But what if I just don't like my freckles? Who decides?
What does the future hold for genetic modification?
Pretty much everything we think is incurable could be curable potentially. Certainly, we can fix broken genes, especially if the disease is caused by a single gene. If we know the genetic basis for a person's cancer, we could probably cure that. But more complex diseases that may involve many genes, but also environmental inputs, will take longer. Also, genes where an entire chromosome is gained, like Down syndrome, may be a bit more tricky.
Do you believe some current genetic technologies exceed general ethical boundaries? If so, how?
Basically, it's about who makes the decision. It shouldn't be up to scientists, because we are not trained to think about all the ramifications. It shouldn't be politicians, because most of them are idiots and they have ulterior motives. It shouldn't be religious leaders, because it's wrong to impose one's religion's beliefs on other people. It should be a mixture of all the above. But then there's enforcement. How do you stop nefarious countries and peoples from trying to profit off these technologies?
Gene editing could lead to cures of various genetic conditions and diseases. What are some of the positive ways that genetic modifications affect our world today?
Diseases are the obvious ones, but also immune strengthening. Genetic editing could also help make stronger crops, improve farming and agriculture, get rid of pests, change the way in which certain nutrients are utilized in the environment, help rid the earth of toxins by, for example, generating bacteria that eat up certain toxins. The possibilities are endless.
Genetic engineering is considered by many to be dangerous from a physical, ethical, and political standpoint. Do you believe that the potential benefits of genetic engineering are worth the risks involved?
Although I work on gene modification, I honestly don't know the answer to this question. Elon Musk, when asked, will answer that he thinks that artificial intelligence will kill us all. So I think being so close to these technologies makes it all more real just how dangerous they can be.
What do you believe genetic modification could lead to for our world, positively or negatively?
Altering genes in humans. The positives, it cures diseases. The negatives, designer babies and nefarious peoples, aka evil scientists. Crop genetics. The positives, disease resistance, help defeat the growing population and resistance to parasites. Negatives, unexpected consequences. Altered ecosystem, one crop takes over, etc. Upset the food chain effectively. And food production. Positives, produce cattle that make more meat and produce cattle that express certain vitamins and factors. Negative, we upset the ecosystem and alter the nutritional value of food. The scientific community absorbs genetic modification as both an amazing blessing and a terrifying curse. On the one hand, we have created cures for diseases long thought impossible, and yet at the same time, we may end up creating a disease, bacteria, or organism that ends up wiping us out. We could very well bastardize the creation of the human form to a point where we no longer recognize our own species. So the scientific community observes a very, very, very present ethical boundary when going in to genetic modification. However, if we want the full scope of ethicality, we must turn our eyes towards the church. So let us go now towards Roman Catholicism. Yeah, okay, I'm still doing the bit. We're almost done. One of the easiest places to look for ethical reasoning is the Bible. These verses stand out as easily applicable even by today's standards and problems.
Genesis chapter 1 verses 24 to 31. Then God said, "Let the earth bring forth living creatures after their kind, cattle and creeping things and beasts of the earth after their kind." And it was so. God made the beasts of the earth after their kind, and the cattle after their kind, and everything that creeps on the ground after its kind. And God saw that it was good. Then God said, "Let us make man in our image, according to our likeness, and let them rule over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the sky, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth." God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. God blessed them, and said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth, and subdue it, and rule over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the sky, and over every living thing that moves on the earth." Then God said, "Behold, I have given you every plant yielding seed that is on the surface of all the earth, and every tree which has fruit yielding seed. It shall be food for you. And to every beast of the earth, and to every bird of the sky, and to everything that moves on the earth which has life, I have given every green plant for food." And it was so. God saw that all he had made, and behold, it was very good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the sixth day.
This verse speaks to the perfection of God's creation. He made man in his own image and gave us animals and plants for our survival. He made everything perfectly, and while we may tamper with things genetically, he made things the way he believed to be true. And since he is perfect, his creation must be perfect. So therefore we must truly limit ourselves with what we believe are the boundaries of genetic modification.
Ecclesiastes chapter 7, verse 13. "Consider the work of God, for who is able to straighten what he has bent?"
We are given this idea of who are we to go against God's will. While our sense of ethicality becomes more and more tuned, we still lack an idea of where agriculture lies. Agriculture was placed in the hands of humanity to care for and protect, but also to take dominion over. So how much dominion is too much dominion?
Organisms reproduce, whether they're plants or animals, they pass on their DNA. And when an organism is genetically modified, their DNA is modified to give them desirable traits that humans can use for their own benefit. For example, GMOs are most commonly used in farming, so that organisms that are genetically modified can be changed to increase yield or become more resistant to pesticide. And today, most GMOs in agriculture are plants and not animals. And especially genetically modifying animals is something that can be seen as a bit controversial. However, genetic modification is used in things that are much less controversial, such as environmental cleanups, when genetically modified bacteria are used to break down oils and plastics so they can be more quickly recycled in the environment. But however, the church is against genetically modifying organisms, as they see it as humans trying to play God with God's creation, and that sort of ruins the sacredness that we're supposed to have for creation. And also, the church sees it as us not properly being stewards of God's creation, which we believe that he made perfectly for us.
Perhaps one of the final and most important individuals to look at when looking at the ethicality of the situation is the Pope himself.
Pope Francis makes it clear that it is necessary to consider negative consequences of genetic modification and that indiscriminate genetic manipulation is not acceptable. He reassures that human creativity cannot be suppressed, but highlights the considerable risk inherent to the power of human activity, which impose the need to rethink the goals, effects, overall context, and ethical limits of such an impact. In an interview, Pope Francis praised scientists searching for treatments for genetic diseases, but cautioned against the use of human embryos in their research. Pope Francis encouraged geneticists to pursue scientific advancement only through means that do not contribute to the throwaway culture, which treats human beings as objects for use. He continues saying, "Some branches of research use human embryos, inevitably causing their destruction. But we know that no ends, even noble in themselves, such as a predicted utility for science, for other human beings, or for society, can justify the destruction of human embryos. No doubt there is a need for constant attention to consider all ethical aspects involved. To this end, it is necessary to ensure a scientific and social debate that is responsible and large, and able to consider all the information available. Pope Francis concludes by saying that genetic modification is an issue which is complex, and it must be approached with a sympathetic look at all its aspects. And this requires at least one more effort to finance several lines of independent and interdisciplinary research, as genetic modification is unlikely to be able to self-limit its power.
Despite its recognition in both scientific and religious spheres, genetic modification has remained fairly unknown for a long period of time. However, as time goes on and science develops, it appears that more and more people will truly understand what genetic modification means, given that as of right now, 1 in 5 couples have an infertile male. About 12 to 13 out of every 100 couples in the United States will have trouble being pregnant, given that 6.1 million women in the United States, ages 15 to 44, have difficulty becoming pregnant or staying pregnant. And as of right now, in the United States, 10 to 15 out of 100 pregnancies end in miscarriage. Most couples nowadays will never have children, or never live to see the possibility of having children. With genetic modification, scientists open those doors up to those loving couples who wish to have a child of their own. And as society grows to understand this technology more and more, perhaps we will truly begin to grasp the limits of genetic modification. However, that is just society's point of view. For younger teens such as myself and my peers, genetic modification is a bit more of a polarizing issue, as some know while others do not. So let's see our point of view.
In my opinion, genetic modification can be a very useful type of technology, especially when it is used correctly to do things like prevent diseases. And because it's such a powerful tool, I believe that it should be done under the government supervision and only by genetic engineering experts. And when it's done on humans, I think there should be 100% consent. And also, since it's basically a relatively new type of technology, it's practically experimental, so I think that when it's done on humans, embryos, and fetuses, that it should be done with a conservative approach and not to do things like make superhuman babies.
I think if genetic testing is used to help people in an ethical way, then and it's beneficial for society as a whole, then I don't see anything wrong with it. For example, GMOs in poorer countries can be used to increase yields, which will help farmers feed their populations much more efficiently than they currently can. And also something else is genetically modified bacteria can be used in environmental cleanups, and they can break down oils and plastics that normally take very long to break down in nature. So that'll help us clean up the environment, and ultimately one day that could be what we use to completely clean up the earth.
I believe that genetic engineering can be a truly great thing for this world. It can aid in medicine through the treatment of genetic diseases and other ailments, while also providing ways to create healthier and faster growing crops. Of course, with the numerous benefits of genetic engineering come some major potential issues. The ethical dilemmas that could follow genetic modifications, such as the cloning of humans, would be highly controversial, as we're attempting to play the role of God. I think that genetic modification should only be used to benefit humans, but should never be exploited as a way to attempt to create perfect beings, as we are all perfectly made in God's image already. I believe that genetic engineering should never be used on humans outside of maybe some genetic treatments of diseases, with the primary focus of genetics being plants and possibly animals. If we maintain rigid ethical boundaries throughout the development and use of genetic engineering, we can use it to safely improve our world and well-being.
Gene modification is something that is not only new, but terrifying to both religious and scientific communities. Most people are working with new technologies they've never seen before. We haven't had the time to understand the ramifications of dabbling with something as precious as DNA. Now, while there are so many amazing possibilities for us going forward, while there are so many diseases to be cured and lives to be saved, we also have to worry about what could go wrong, as too much of a good thing could cause the apocalypse. When wondering how should I end this project, I looked towards Paula Cohen's interview. When asked what is your overall opinion on human genetic modifications, she answered with 5 very important questions that I believe were best suited towards the end of this. And she says, all that given, I am in for disease preventing or quality of life enhancing modifications if and only if many preconditions are met and if certain things can be agreed on. Number 1, who decides what's acceptable? 2, who decides the cost? Number 3, do we just restrict practices in the US or should this be a global decision? 4, if we reverse some disorder but only give a few more years of life, is it worth it? Who decides whether it's worth it or not? And 5, and more importantly for the science, when do we decide that we've done enough research to determine side effects? If we cure one disease but inadvertently cause another, we're back where we started. All these questions are excellent questions to consider when considering the morality of genetic modification. The entire idea isn't one clean-cut, simple line. There are many gray areas we have to address before we can approach the future. The question is, will we be able to make that future a better one, or will we be too afraid to answer these questions on both a religious and scientific basis? And that is all you need to know about genetic modification and its moral